Now, on to the really fun part. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. You probably heard this a bunch of times, Tiffany, so I'm sorry. With 30 years of experience in the 30 years of experience, it started when she was 10 years old. So in the hospitality and tourism industry, Tiffany Ahalt has held leadership roles with the National Road Heritage Foundation, the C&O Canal Association, Howard County, Maryland Tourism Council, and the Maryland National Road Association. A promoter of Washington County as a visitor destination, and at dinner we were able to find out quite a bit more about that. Very impressive. She recently chaired Frederick County's Rural and Scenic Roads Advisory Committee, which was instrumental in creating an official commission overseeing the designation and protection of the county's most historic, scenic, and unaltered rural roads. Please join me in welcoming Tiffany Ahalt.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. All right, great. Such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I feel honored. I feel like I'm in a room of royalty here with such great historians and educators, so thank you. And I think this is my first presentation about the National Road in West Virginia. I usually always talk about the road, I think, in Maryland. So again, as historians, we never stop learning, so it gave me an opportunity to really learn more about the National Road and its history and its presence here, which was Virginia, but now West Virginia. So it gave me a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about your wonderful state. And honored to be here to talk about the road. It's funny how, as we get older, we appreciate history, we appreciate places and some of the basic things in life, and we all get in the car and drive. So we have lots of opportunities to think about these kinds of places and stories and history as we travel. In America, we've always been on the move, right? By road, rail, horseback, car, trolley, airplane. We've always been in the quest to get from point A to point B in the fastest, most convenient way. But it's not always been that way. And certainly most of our transportation history started with the National Road. And so I'm happy to share the story with you tonight, a little bit of the history. The National Road is one of those subjects, though, that you could focus on the politics. You could focus on the engineering. There's so many different aspects to the National Road where you could just spend hours and hours talking about it. But I'm a firm believer in setting the stage with the history, but I also want to educate you about these historic byways and how we can all be stewards of saving the landscapes and the treasures in the main streets that dot those scenic byways. And so when I talk about the National Road, I also like to break it up into eras because it certainly had its highs and lows over the years, starting in the 1800s all the way up to present day. So it's kind of the easiest way to give a talk about the National Road is if we break it down by era, particularly when we think about a lot of the other transportation and occurrences that happened in our American history as well. You may have heard of Route 66, the Lincoln Highway. National Road is not as sexy, but it certainly is interesting, I would find as well. So by the beginning of the 19th century, many government officials viewed the need to improve access to the West, which was vital to the political and economic survival of our young nation. In 1806, after much discussion and back and forth like most politicians do, there was a consensus that we definitely needed this road. And so in 1806, Congress authorized the funds to construct the National Road, America's first interstate or highway. Construction would start in 1811 in Cumberland, Maryland. So you can imagine that a lot of the back and forth about this road was where the route would go, right? Because every politician wanted the route to come conveniently by their front door, right? Because one of the reasons for the road, obviously, was to be able to connect points west to Washington, D.C., and certainly seaports there in Baltimore. So there was a lot of the discussion and the back and forth was where would the route go? We can thank people like Albert Gallatin, if you ever do your homework, who was probably most instrumental in helping to create the actual route as we know it today. And so a lot of people ask, well, why did the road start in Maryland? Well, I always say that the road from Baltimore to Cumberland really kind of created the vision for the national road, because in the end of the late 1700s, people like the Ellicott brothers and Charles Carroll were very instrumental in creating roads to be able to get their products to the seaport in Baltimore. Eventually, that road would make its way to Frederick, the great city of Frederick, and eventually on to Hagerstown, and then connecting with Cumberland. So that road definitely created the vision for what could be if you have a great roadway, and the importance of being able to get the agricultural products to and from the seaports. So Maryland, particularly Western Maryland, Cumberland, had the northernmost point of the Potomac River. The goal for the national road was to connect the Potomac River to the Ohio River and eventually points west. And at that time, state of Maryland had no interest in continuing their road over the Allegheny Mountains, right? Why would they? It took them long enough to be able to get their road constructed from Baltimore to Western Maryland, so they had no interest. So it definitely fell upon the federal government to be able to start that road over the Alleghenies into points west. Other things going on in our country. Obviously, expansion to the west was important, the Louisiana Purchase. Trade and commerce, so many agricultural products, we need to get them to and from. Mail, postal routes was extremely important. Communication was very important. So all of these really weighed heavily on people being able to vote to get the road created. So once the construction funds were authorized in 1806, several companies were hired to construct several sections of the road. And like everything else, especially public works projects, there was a lot of controversy, because there were people who didn't show up for the work, or they did a shoddy job building, or there weren't things paid and things were over budget. So it was quite an interesting process getting the road built. It took a very, very long time. Now, most of the people who worked on the road would have probably been a lot of the folks who emigrated to our country. A lot of Irish and Scotch worked on the road, certainly varied depending upon where they were doing the actual construction. One of the other interesting things about the National Road is that it has a lot of many different names depending upon where you're traveling on the road. People get very confused about this. Early on, people would refer to the Cumberland Road. The Cumberland Road and the National Road were two and the same. But if I'm traveling in Frederick, I might be on Route 144, or particularly in the cities, they all have different names. So a lot of people get very confused. And a little bit later, we'll talk about the difference between US 40 and the National Road. That's another one that people always ask. So as work on the road progressed, a settlement pattern developed that is still visible today. And if you travel the road, you're going to go through those main streets, and you're going to be on corridors that once would have been traveled by 6-horse Conestoga wagons, herds and herds of mules and cattle and hogs. And unfortunately, many of those beautiful view sheds still exist, particularly in the more rural areas. The road, as I mentioned, also called the Cumberland Road, National Road, and other names, also became Main Street in these early settlements. This is really where our earliest nickname of Main Street came about. We've got a lot of great main streets in our areas today. In fact, we even have a Main Street Association in America, which helps a lot of these Main Street communities with preservation and promotion. The height of the National Road's popularity came in 1825, when it was celebrated in song, story, painting, and poetry. So again, I talked about breaking it down in just different eras, and I'm going to start with that 1800 to 1850. Everybody might be familiar with the amazing Conestoga wagons. That would have been the tractor trailer of the day. And these were massive wagons that were first built in Pennsylvania. They were often pulled by 6 or 8 horse teams. Usually the larger horses would have pulled these wagons. And they would have been really instrumental with really moving a lot of the goods, mainly agricultural goods, up and down the up and down the road. So this also created a lot of problems because with the weight of these, their wagon wheels were about 10 feet wide. So you can imagine a muddy road or going down a hill, particularly if you had a 6 horses or 8 horses going down a hill, you had to use your brakes, so that really dug into the road there. So they really created a lot of issues, but they, again, were really carrying their weight, no pun intended, to really get the goods to and from. One of the biggest issues with the National Road early on was maintenance, because they did not, although they provided funds to build the road, they did not provide adequate funds to maintain the road. Now, this was the finest road of its day. It was still dirt. It still did not have a hard surface. And with rain and snow and the constant traffic, it certainly made a very negative impact on the quality of the road after some time. Now, here's a good map that shows the actual road itself again. For the purpose of it being a historic National Road Scenic Byway, we have the route going from Baltimore through Maryland, and then at the bottom you can see where it goes through the other states and ends in Vandalia, Illinois. Most people today, historians, when you talk about the National Road, they only recognize Cumberland West because that was the federally funded portion. But many of us, like people, myself today, when we talk about the road, we talk about the National Scenic By All-American Road, which again goes from Baltimore to Vandalia, Illinois. So some of the interesting assets that still exist today for the National Road, and part of the story, are mile markers. Has anyone ever seen any of the mile markers on the National Road? Right. So there are many mile markers that still exist, surprisingly. Sometimes, particularly the ones in Maryland, you have to really look hard to find them. And probably the more prominent that still remain are those here to the right side, which you would find from Cumberland moving west there. Now, these mile markers, I always like to say, are we there yet? This would have really been the true source for travelers to know where they were. And if you think about it, not everybody could read then. So they had a lot of symbolism, and these mile markers with the numbers really helped to guide the travelers because they didn't have the street signs. And I can see the kids asking, are we there yet? And certainly when they would see the mile markers, they know where they would be at their destination. 82M to B, 82 miles to Baltimore. So their distance on the old National Pike between Baltimore and Cumberland would have been in that type of style. In total, those stones were about 6 feet high. Of course, you only see a part of it sticking out of the ground there. And then once you got into Cumberland, this is the style that you would see here. And these mile markers, of course, mile markers really have been around for 2,000 years. Some of our earliest ancestors in Europe, it was typical to use these mile markers. And of course, there are a lot of other unique historic stones here in our area too, in particular Mason-Dixon markers. And I think at the museum I was at earlier, there was a Civil War marker there as well. In Maryland, mile marker number 3 still exists in Baltimore, Maryland. It's heading right down into the city. If anybody's familiar with Catonsville and Irvington, you can still see mile marker number 3, which is amazing. Unfortunately, over the years, we're losing quite a few of those markers today. Engineering marvels. Again, we talked about different topics on the National Road. You could just focus a whole session on engineering marvels of the National Road. People who are surveyors or engineers or builders love the National Road, and some of our country's most iconic engineering marvels really were constructed first here on the National Road. This is Castleman River Bridge in Grantsville. It was the first type bridge of this nature, was built in 1813, and it was thought that it might collapse. So the night before they had the opening, apparently they had some type of structure built underneath and had cars and not cars, but they had horses drive over the top of the bridge just to make sure it would not collapse. But I can tell you, it's remained there since 1813, and now it's part of the park there. But it is one of the first bridges of its type that was on the bridge there as well. Next is wheeling. So as I mentioned earlier, this was my opportunity to learn a little bit more about the National Road's history and presence in West Virginia. And certainly the Wheeling Suspension Bridge was the first of its kind and the longest for many years in our country until the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed. This was, I believe, the years for this that it was constructed. It only lasted about 5 years. And it was built in 1849, and it lasted until 1851. And as I understand, there was a tornado or a terrible storm that pretty much demolished the original bridge. The bridge that we know today was constructed in 1856. And it was one of those great iconic structures that when you travel the National Road, you go over that bridge today. I had a little video, but it wouldn't play on here. But this is a great, if anybody wants my presentation, there's a great little link to this 2-minute video that talks about the history of the Wheeling Bridge, Wheeling Suspension Bridge. Macadam, anybody familiar with the process of macadam? Okay, so macadam was, okay, yeah, you got your piking hammer. Yes, excellent, excellent. Fantastic. Well, macadam, this, first of all, this is a fairly new artwork, painting that was done, commissioned by artist Richard Schleck, who, by the National Road Heritage Foundation. Richard has done murals for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and a couple other museums here in the area. I'm a dog lover, and he always puts his dogs in his art, his painting, so you can see his dog there. But this is great because the museum had this commission. This will be, you're kind of getting a sneak peek here. This will be an exhibit that talks about engineering and paving and road construction. And this is showing a beautiful, beautiful picture of the process of macadam here too. There's a historic picture by artist Rackham, I believe, that you usually can see in any history book that talks about the National Road. And it's very similar, but it's very, very dark. But Richard painted this for us, and he just does a beautiful job of really showing the detail of this process. And macadam actually was created by a Scotsman, and obviously the process was first done in Europe, but he brought it over here, and it is said that the first macadam road took place between Boonesborough and Hagerstown between 1821 and 1823. I had somebody ask me that thought it might have been done in the Shenandoah Valley, but I have not been able to find anything that states otherwise, that it was not done here in this part of, in Washington County, which is kind of very interesting. When the maintenance plan started to be put in place for the National Road, it was required and requested that all the rest of the roadway had to be done in a macadam style because this was so successful. And a little bit of the process here that it shows it is that the workers had to crush larger stones into small 2-inch stones. They would have a ring that they could pass through to make sure they met that diameter. If you didn't have a ring, they said you could put it in your mouth. Not how good, sure how that good was good for their dentistry. And then eventually, and that's the 2-inch ring, and then it would create tightly packed layers. And then they were compacted further by a cast iron roller, and if you can see the cast iron roller kind of in the back there as well. And you can see how laborious this process was, but with water being the #1 enemy of the road, they needed to really elevate the road bed. They'd have ditches on the side, and compacting it down just gave it a much harder surface that was easier to maintain. So this was really kind of our earliest form of paving as we know it today, and certainly our style is a little bit different, but macadam is a great example of what was our earliest forms of paving. And this gentleman over here was so kind to bring his hammer. He can show us his piking hammer there. All right. So if anybody wants to go out and do a demonstration, thank you, sir. So toll houses. About the time that the federal government decided that they no longer wanted to fund the construction of the road, which that ended in Vandalia, Illinois in 1838, it was really about the 1830s that they decided that they no longer wanted to maintain the road. So about that time, they started turning the maintenance over to the individual states. So that is why we really have tolls as we know them today, because other parts of the country, particularly from Baltimore to Western Maryland, it was turnpike fever, because there were all these little roads and turnpikes that were being created, and they were created by businessmen and banks who financed them, because again, the whole goal was to get their products to and from their market. So it was an investment for them to fund those roads. But no better way to pay for the maintenance than create the tolls. So the federal government, as they turned these over to the states then created their own toll systems. They created the toll houses, much like lighthouses and lockkeeper houses. Families lived here, and they carried out the duties of collecting the tolls that would then go to finance the maintenance. sadly, excuse me, there are very few toll houses that remain, but I would say some of the most outstanding examples and sites that you can visit today are not too far from here, and I'm sharing a couple with you today. On the left is the Sea Rights Toll House, and which this is in Pennsylvania here, and it is a great site to visit. They have a lot of the original furnishings, and Thomas Seawright wrote an excellent book about the National Road. Yes, sir.
Yes, it's between Uniontown and Brownsville.
Brownsville, yes, thank you.
I grew up 3 miles away from it. So
Oh,
I know it well.
excellent, good. I better be on my toes, so. Thank you for sharing that. But would you agree it's an excellent place to visit and just
It is.
very iconic for the toll houses?
And they now have little sheep statues representing the flocks that used to have to pay a toll there. So it's kind of fun.
Yes, excellent, excellent. And then here to your right is the LaVale Toll House. And so this is coming out of Cumberland, coming out of Cumberland. LaVale is actually a town between Cumberland and Frostburg. And this is located on what we know as US 40 today. But it's another excellent, excellent example of what the toll house would have been like and history about the families. Yes, sir.
This is in LaVale?
Yes,
Like
it's
downtown
yeah, it's
somewhere?
right next to all fast food restaurants and,
Yeah.
and anywhere USA as I call it. But yes, it's so as you're heading out of town, it's on the left-hand side there. So you have to look. The Allegheny Tourism manages this, and they are open on weekends. But if you get a chance, it's great to visit it as well. But yeah, unfortunately it just got overshadowed by Anywhere USA, as I like to call it there. So that's two, and then in Hancock, not too far from here. So again, this would have been on the old National Pike from Baltimore to Cumberland, and this is in Hancock, Maryland, on Route 144, which kind of parallels 70 as we know it today. This has been vacant for many years, but the Hancock Historical Society and the town just took it over, and they've started opening this up to the public now as well. So I love this because, again, we talked about the tolls, right? Well, there were so many different rates depending upon if you were on horseback or you had a Conestoga wagon or you were walking with your livestock. And I believe the Conestoga wagons probably had the highest amount of toll, which made sense because they were hauling their goods. And as I mentioned, their wagon wheels were the largest and most detrimental to the road itself in terms of creating a lot of ruts, dust and everything else. So this is actually, they do have this on the side of the LaVale Toll House as well as the Hancock, and I think they also have that in the Sea Rights Toll House as well. But it's pretty interesting there. For every cart or wagon whose wheels exceed 3 inches and does not exceed 4 inches, for every horse or pair of oxen. So whoever was at the toll house had to get out and probably measure the wagon wheels, count the number of livestock, and collect the tolls. And of course, people did their best to avoid the tolls, I'm sure, but you probably weren't able to do that early on with the Conestoga wagon. So getting into the next era of the National Road, 1850 to 1900. Of course, some of the earliest forms of tourism, I believe, started on the National Road when we think about the inns and taverns, much like our hotels, motels, Airbnbs today. We also had many places that catered to the travelers, and of course, those days before the horseless carriage, we would have had places, blacksmiths, harness makers, all the people that could cater to those people traveling on the National Road. Inns and taverns, probably one of my favorites. There was probably inn or a tavern almost every mile. Again, because many people were not able to read, you would identify the inns and taverns by the signs. Inns and taverns that would accommodate those with animals usually had an animal head on them. And that was where you got your news of the day. You had your entertainment and certainly your food and drink and rest. Lots of great stories about some of the most famous inns and taverns. Their fare probably would be venison, local game, and drink. We can't forget drink, right? You can imagine all kinds of good drink flowing at these inns and taverns. Certainly in Maryland, they would have had a lot of rye whiskey, but other places they probably would have had Scotch and Irish whiskey, American whiskeys, and probably a lot of different types of beer as well. A lot of their meals were served family style, and people actually, believe it or not, would sleep on the ground. Some of these places had enormous areas where they could keep their lots of mules or their herd of hogs. And then this certainly was a place where the animals could rest as well. Today, what's interesting is, believe it or not, we still have a few of these inns and taverns left. Places like Grantsville, Maryland, you can go to the Castleman Inn and have food and drink there. Sadly, anybody familiar with the South Mountain Inn that was in Frederick, Washington County? So South Mountain Inn just closed, no longer a restaurant, but the Maryland Park Service has acquired that property. They are it's going to be offices, a visitor center, and some interpretive exhibits as well. Tremendous amount of history there with Battle of South Mountain, the National Road, and others, Madeline Dahlgren. So while it will not serve people with food and drink, it'll still serve visitors to a degree, and they will certainly save that treasured property. There are other places as you head on into Pennsylvania. Sir, you got any good places you can recommend in Pennsylvania?
I own the Boyd Tavern in Brownsville. It hasn't run as a tavern since 1835, so I can't offer you any hospitality. You also missed the first cast iron bridge in North America, which is in Brownsville on Route 4.
In Brownsville, yes, and there are others too. Again, my presentation is very limited. If we traveled all 874 miles, we'll be here for a couple of days. But you're exactly right. And if the bridges really interest you, I encourage you to learn more. There's a lot of great resources if you really take that journey for sure. And he's good. We're going to have him come in to focus on the National Road in his area. Earlier I mentioned mile marker 3 here to your right. This was Fairview Inn, and this was one of the first probably inns and taverns on the old National Pike served, you can imagine, coming out of Baltimore City. But this is where the building no longer stands, but mile marker number 3 is still there. So look for that if you take the National Road into Baltimore City there. So American Civil War, National Road played a very prominent role during the American Civil War, primarily during the Antietam and Gettysburg campaigns, obviously first starting with getting a lot of the supplies to and from the various locations. There are many diaries that talk about eyewitness accounts of seeing miles and miles of blue and gray marching on the old National Pike. It was probably very significant after the battles. When we think about the battles of Antietam, certainly South Mountain, and maybe even to a degree Gettysburg, it was very instrumental in transporting a lot of the wounded soldiers to the hospitals in the little towns, and certainly even to places like Hagerstown and Frederick as well. So the National Road Museum, they'll have a little smidget about the Civil War, and it'll really focus on the transportation aspect of the American Civil War. Some of my favorites are, I love artwork and how it ties to our history. Alfred Wald, I believe, is the artist on the far left. He's done a lot of sketches during the Civil War. This is one of my favorite because these are soldiers marching through Middletown, right on the old National Pike there. It's just an immaculate picture of what that would have been like. Good roads movement. So obviously, from the time the road construction started, we know on July 1828, we broke ground for the C&O Canal and the B&O Railroad, which both of those really had, for the most part, a pretty negative impact on National Road, especially for towns that didn't have access to the canal or didn't have the railroad coming through their town. There was really a decline in terms of traffic on the National Road. But soon it would pick up again because thanks to the good roads movement, the invention of bicycles, particularly in urban areas, cyclists were really taking over. That was really becoming a preferred way of transportation, mainly for people in urban areas, but rural as well. One of the things I personally like about cyclists is it didn't matter what your occupation was or if you were wealthy or you were poor, everybody could ride a bicycle. The bank president could be riding next to the person that took care of the animals or the housekeeper. And so About the 1870s, there was what became known as the Good Roads Movement. And this was the National Wheelmen's Association was really instrumental. They wanted roads to be improved. And they were actually more instrumental probably than folks who were creating the automobiles at the same time. And again, these are some great pictures here, particularly for women. Another example of a place that you can visit is Washington County Rural Heritage Museum, which has an amazing collection of the earliest bicycles that were manufactured. Crawford bicycles, Pope bicycles, and even some that were manufactured in Hagerstown as well. They have a tremendous collection there, in addition to their automobiles and agricultural artifacts as well. Washington County Rural Heritage Museum is at the Washington County Agricultural Center there in Sharpsburg. This great picture here to your far right, these gentlemen, I don't know how they made it, but they are standing on top of South Mountain there near Braddock Heights. And I love how everybody dressed then. So Good Roads Movement, and about that time, some of the earliest inventions of automobiles were really occurring at that time, mainly in Europe, and then making their way here across the pond. So between the combination of folks trying to invent cars and take them on long journeys, the cyclists helped to really make improvements to our road. So I also just want to share a little bit about the different organizations that had been created over the years that really had been instrumental in managing roads, to putting in laws into place. And so in 1893, with the efforts of the Good Roads Movement, the Office of Road Inquiry was founded. And later this would evolve into our Federal Highway Administration and some of the organizations that we know today at the federal level. So we're moving into 1900s to 1950, and of course, automobiles were really well underway. We can thank people like Henry Ford, who really, with the Model T, he really perfected the production of automobiles and mass consumption, and so made it that everybody and their mother could have a Model T and drive. So that really fast forwarded our country in terms of wanting to improve our roads and create a lot of the amenities, filling stations, places to repair your cars, all of the necessities needed for road travel in a horseless carriage, as I like to say. As we continue on, again, more of the evolution of tourism. You know, the places that were the old inns and taverns needed to change a little bit, right? They needed to have parking spaces for cars. They needed to change up their menus a little bit. They needed to really embrace technology. And so some of those earliest companies to really embrace that and do it well would be like the Marriott's with hot shops, and Howard Johnson's. And not only was it food, but it was a lot of the motels that some still remain today, but a lot of them you see abandoned. A lot of our roadside advertising, actually on the earliest years of the National Road, when we would see murals on barns or signs for any kind of services, really started along the National Road. And throughout the years, they would certainly evolve into things for filling stations and some of the places to stop and see along the road as well. Postcards, again, postcards really, I love collecting vintage postcards, and really were a way for people to share their experiences as they traveled and promote the destinations as well. In 1905, the Office of Road Inquiry was changed to the Office of Public Roads, which later became a division of the United States Department of Agriculture. And then that name was changed again to the Bureau of Public Roads in 1915, and eventually the Public Roads Administration in 1939. When the Federal Works Agency was abolished in 1949, its name reverted to Bureau of Public Roads under the Department of Commerce. And then in 1912, the road became part of the National Old Trails Road, and then the popularity of the road again returned in the 1920s with the popularity of the automobile. A lot of federal money was invested in the infrastructure along the road, and thus in 1926, the road became known as US 40, and that's when our country decided to turn to a numbered road system. So the intercontinental national road became a transcontinental road. And so with that then came US 40, the Dixie Highway, and some of the other roads that we know today.
So, so is it Route 40 all the way out of Baltimore, but you also mentioned 144?
Yep. So here's the map that when we became the numbered highway system. So unfortunately, they have 70, not 40 here, but 70 parallels 40. And so then it became, actually New Jersey, 40 started in New Jersey and would make it all the way to the West Coast. But what's confusing though is if I'm on that road, there are places where alternate 40, right? Like Frederick County is probably my best example. I can be on alternate 40, which is the original route, and then I have 70, and then I have US 40. So they all kind of parallel. And in some places like Hancock, if I'm going to Hancock on 70, 144 goes right, or 70 goes right over the original 144 corridor. In places like Cumberland, the road is probably two different roads now, so it has changed over the years. There's certain places where you can be on the original alignment, but other places it's just completely gone, or it's 1 lane to 2 lanes. It's very confusing. The only thing I will say, unlike some of the other byways, it's probably easier to follow because it's truly an east-west corridor as opposed to some of the other byways. But there are some good resources if you really want to travel as much of the original alignments. So 1950 to present, eventually President Eisenhower created our interstate system, 1956, I believe. So all the interstates we're on today that we get there as fast as we can were created, and certainly that created another demise to the national road. But thanks to some other systems, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, a life has come back to the national road. So again, I wanted to talk about the National Scenic Byways program. And first of all, Federal Highway Administration was officially created in 1966. Federal Highway Administration was instrumental in creating this National Scenic Byways program around the end of the 1990s. And they started realizing that we have all these amazing roads that have so much history, heritage. They connect our main streets, which we're trying to revitalize. And they created this program. And when it was created, they provided hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars all across the country to these communities that had these roads, Route 66, Lincoln Highway, all these amazing roads and communities, to give them a chance to put signage up so you can recognize the routes and travel them, and money to put in infrastructure and way signs and education and information to teach our residents and our visitors about the history of that road and its importance. A lot of states have their own individual byway programs, usually not long after the national program was created. Some states created their own, or others like Maryland already had a state scenic byway program. Now these programs, there's 2 different types of designations for the national program. One is an all-American road, and one is a national scenic byway. And basically you have to have certain intrinsic qualities to meet these characters. National road was so significant that it's an all-American road and a national scenic byway. Now since we're here in West Virginia, you all have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have 6 national scenic byways, all-American roads. That's pretty significant. So make sure you get a chance to go out and travel these, including the national road. Now, one of the things they did is you can see at the top, when you know you're on a national scenic byway, you have that logo there. And then each state has its own specific signage. Unfortunately, in Maryland, we don't have the same signage that the other 5 states in the national road have, because Maryland is the worst for road signage. You can tell anybody that. They're sticklers to signage. So you'll see this brown sign here. But again, the point with the signage is to help travelers stay on the road and know that they're on the original alignment as well. So here, lots of great resources. West Virginia, this is your State Office of Tourism's website, and they have a terrific web page that has their state scenic byways as well as the national scenic byways. And here they give you suggested itineraries and even routes and maps. So that's a great resource And I commend West Virginia. They've done it. They have a great resources for the National Road. Here in Maryland, we do have a Wayside Interpretive Trail. In the early 90s, we were given money to create this signage system, and we have 50 signs from downtown Baltimore out to the Maryland-PA line where you can learn about the National Road as you travel. It's very similar to the Civil War Trails program, but this focuses on the National Road. Some of the other 5 states also have similar programs, but I do think Maryland is the most comprehensive. And again, you'll find them on main streets, you'll find them by the Castleman Bridge, and just various places to help people to connect to the stories, people, and places on the road. A lot of great events that still remain to celebrate the history of roads. Slowly, a lot of them are disappearing. If anybody's familiar with wagon train festivals, we have 2, actually there's 3. I can't count the one that's in Pennsylvania, Uniontown, that area that heads east. We do have the James Shaw Wagon Train Festival, which takes place in May. They start on a Friday at Plum Grove and Clear Spring, and then by Sunday they arrive in Boonesboro. People who participate in these are all volunteers. If anybody has horses or livestock, it's very expensive to keep these animals and to be able to transport them, especially for a full weekend. There are people as far as Delaware that come every year to keep this history and heritage alive. They love for people to pet their animals. They travel the entire road, and it really, really connects you to history and heritage of the earliest days of travel on the road. This bottom here is that same wagon train going over the Wilson Bridge, which is in Washington County as well. And then Grantsville also has a great National Road Festival. They also do a wagon train there as well. Anybody ever heard of the historic National Road Yard Sale? 870 miles of yard sale. One man's or woman's junk is definitely another's treasure. This continues to grow. It really is dependent upon the individual communities and their ability to organize people, but I think we're going to continue to grow this and get more people basically just to set up your yard sale on 40 and then get on lists where people who really can go out and travel the road to go to the yard sales. A couple other places where they really do a good job of telling the history of the National Road and getting a chance to really see artifacts is in Cumberland, Maryland at the Allegheny Museum. These pictures don't justify their new exhibits, but they have life-size exhibits of a Conestoga wagon and model horses and just wonderful, wonderful exhibits that really talk about the earliest road construction and history of the road. And of course, you can go and get a selfie where it all started at mile marker 0 there, which is just behind the train station, which is adjacent to the C&O Canal. We had a really great celebration back in 2011 to commemorate that. Yeah, 2011, we commemorated that anniversary, and they erected this brand new monument there. So National Road Museum, I think this is kind of how I received the invitation to be able to spend time with you all tonight to talk about the road is the National Road Heritage Foundation, who is an organization in Boonesboro, is in the process of creating Maryland's first National Road Museum. And I've been saying this for many years, probably over 10. They are finally close to opening their doors late fall. And I feel like I can say that and wager on it. But the museum will open. It is there on Main Street, and they have wonderful exhibits. And it's a small museum, but it really sets the stage and really encourages you and excites you to actually go out and travel the road, which is really a museum of itself, and then visit some of the other places that I've mentioned tonight that have a full-size Conestoga wagon or a 1957 Chevy or a Pope bicycle. Here's their logo here. Of course, we think about the 6 states that make up the road, Maryland, PA, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So these states are what represent the different 6 stars there. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is a fella changing his tire there up in Grantsville. And that would have been 1918. So I always want to include historic preservation and get you to be thinking about it and maybe consider being a steward. Because most of the time when we talk about preservation, we're talking about buildings, right? How many people really think about our roads, right? Because we drive them. We are in a rush to get from point A to point B. We're thinking about preserving what the building is on Main Street. But we really need to think about preserving our historic scenic byways. And that includes the view sheds, right? If I'm traveling up into the mountains, you can see wind turbines really change what that looks like, right? On the left here is a mile marker. This is Howard County. They're right on the side of the road. Look how vulnerable it is to this construction there. We've lost several of these because of car accidents or because we had mile marker 45 in downtown Frederick, right on Patrick Street across from National Museum of Civil Medicine. It was there for hundreds of years until about 5 years ago when a gentleman just backed his car right over it, right? So very vulnerable, and once it's gone, it's gone. But there are other things. Think about billboards, right? Billboards are a real nuisance and eyesore for scenic byways, right? If you take away all the beautiful aesthetic qualities of a scenic byway, it's no longer scenic. It's like the LaVale Toll House, right? I call that Anywhere USA when I can go to Denny's and Banks and every place else that I can go anywhere else. And you lose that historic charm of which was Main Street. So we are really trying to encourage people to be mindful of a lot of the mile markers. When someone is building a house, maybe our planning departments consider them to put their house on another part of the property so it doesn't block the view shed. But we even have a quarter partnership plan in Maryland that towns like Middletown and others, when they're doing their streetscaping, they're putting their parking in the back of the building. They're putting certain landscaping. They're doing signage a different way. They're preserving the historic facades of their buildings to really try to preserve that historic national road integrity. So I want people to think about that because I think we can all be stewards. And also things like trees, removing trees from view sheds, not encouraging people to put up, certain signage. So there are a lot of things and efforts. There's a organization called Scenic America, and along with the Scenic Byways Foundation, they really focus on being a steward and preserving our scenic byways. Because once all those scenic, beautiful things are gone, it's really no longer a scenic byway, is it? So, again, there's so many facets to the story of the historic National Road. I have lots of resources if you're really interested in engineering. Certainly this gentleman here, we need to get him to do a tour for us. We should do a road trip up to Pennsylvania. And again, we just focused on Maryland, our little area. There's 6 states. It is a great road trip. There are other great places in Ohio, Zanesville. You've got to stop in Zanesville. They're really the quintessential road. There used to be the Huddleston House in Indiana, which just sold. But along the road, there are many places that really help to tell the story and places you can still eat and visit today. Cross the bridges, see the Madonnas of the trail, and look for the mile markers. And thank you. And I hope you'll take a road trip, and happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Tiffany?
Yes, ma'am.
How did this come to be your passion?
Can you repeat the question?
How did I get connected, or how did I gain my passion for a road? So I have always loved history, and I was fortunate to have horses my whole life. I had a horse-drawn carriage business for 15 years. And I just really, as you get older, you learn about history and it all connects, right? And then I did a lot of traveling for my work in tourism. And as I'd travel up to Cumberland over the mountains, knowing what it's like to drive a 6-horse wagon, I'd be thinking about what life was like going down that mountain and hoping my brakes would work or I had a good wheel horse. And I just think it really sets the stage when we think about our transportation history and how important it was. And how it really kind of set the stage for other roads. And being a preservation, I love the communities. People want to go, we want to bring life back to our Main Street communities where once we're thriving, we could live and be proud of it. And we have people moving back to those communities now. But all roads lead to those places, right? Certainly we're connected by canals, railroads, but all those roads lead us to those places. And so I wanted to educate people, educate myself, and how we can share the story of the scenic byways and how important they were and how important they are today, and maybe encourage people to travel the scenic byway as opposed to the 70 or the others as well. And I got to be byway manager for the Maryland National Road Association, which when the federally funded program was available, they had those type of organization. When that funding ceased, it all went away. But I just continue to educate myself and learn more. I have not done the whole road trip yet. It's on my bucket list. So, but yeah, if that answers your question, I got to combine horses and history and tourism, so it all fits.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir.
If it's Route 40, how does Pennsylvania fit into Route 40?
Well, from there, it probably cuts across a very slim area. You'd have to look at the map. And there's some places it only cuts through a short area, yeah.
It goes for about 100 miles. through
That's what I'm
Pennsylvania.
saying. Some places it's only certain mileage. Yeah. Yeah, it's so much easier if we have a map that's really good that shows the routes. There are good maps out there. AAA has some good maps in the earlier years, like all the way from like 1830s and up. You can see where the roads evolved over time. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the early beginning of the Bank Road? How it originally got started?
So I'm familiar with the Bank Road from Baltimore up, because again, they were the ones that financed construction and mainly maintenance of those roads, because otherwise nobody would be maintaining them, and it's all about trade and commerce, right, and getting your goods. So they were really most instrumental, the private businessmen and banks, and also probably moving their mail as well as other probably money to and from the various locations.
I read someplace where the state legislature told the banks to finance the road, or they wouldn't have their incorporation.
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah.
This is a pre-capitalist.
Yes, that's what I'm saying is a national road. That was like the earliest forms. We can talk about politics and mandates. It is like the quintessential of really where a lot of that started for sure. That's what I'm saying. There are some great talks I've been to that just focus on the political side of the road itself. But and again, we say it's America's first public works project, and we all know if anybody has done public works projects, we know what that is. Well, the National Road certainly had its fair share of those woes as well. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
One last thing. We talked about horse gear. Do you know about cane bells?
Yes, I heard you had some. Yes, so so anybody remember? I'll be there with bells on. I'll be there with bells on. Well, a lot of the wagoneers, again, they didn't have street lights, right? And they traveled night and day, would have the hame bells on the harness, the hames, and they would ring them to let people know when they were arriving, or if you were in the dark and you were passing through a part of the road where only one wagon could fit, that's where the hame bells came in. And so we all know that in history, a lot of the phrases we use today came from our past. I'll be there with bells on is the one from the National Road. Thank you for sharing those.
The other thing too is that amongst the wagoneers, the guys that were sort of the truck drivers
Yeah.
at the time, if you broke down on the side of the road and somebody rescued you, they took your bells.
Oh, yes,
Same
yes.
thing as if you lost a race, a horse race.
That's so neat, yes.
The prize was not anything except the pride of saying, well, he's running a wagon without bells.
Without bells, yeah. No, it's great. And, the Teamsters, the drovers, and then, we didn't talk about stagecoach relays. Not only did you have the inns and taverns, but you had stagecoach relays. That was the fastest way to travel. And those teams would be at a full gallop. They'd arrive. While the driver stayed in the coach, they'd switch out the teams, and on they would go.
Jockey Hollow. Jockey Hollow is Route 40, just as you're coming across the border from into Pennsylvania. There's a long, straight stretch of road that's almost level, a very odd thing in that part of the mountains. And it's called Jockey Hollow because that's where the races were.
Ah.
They wanted to actually have a meet.
Right, and again, just example of his little small part of the road, how much history, right? So that's the beauty in traveling the road, and all these communities have great lectures and exhibits, and take some time, travel the road. You'd be really surprised at what you find. It's fascinating stories, and so thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Like I said, we never stop learning, so. Thank you. I have cards. If I can share anything, you need more information, thank you. I appreciate it.